I'm gonna share my secret for making amazing traps. I'm gonna show you how to easily fix what's been wrong with them for the past 50 years, using a solution so mind-numbingly simple, it can be applied to literally any role-playing game. Obviously, I could just give you the secret right here at the beginning, but I feel it's important to explain the logic behind my method first. Some may resist my solution, but that's going to be more from force of habit. Use my method and you'll never have problems with traps again. You've just finished your masterpiece, the terrible tomb of Trappy von Trappenstein. You've stocked your dungeon with the most malevolent monsters, and you've spent many hours creating thrilling traps for the tunnels of your tomb. You know your players are going to have a great time because you've followed the advice in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you've watched countless DM tips videos. Then, when the day of your game has arrived and your players are in position, at last the adventure begins. But soon, you discover something has gone terribly wrong. It appears none of your players are having fun. For some reason, your players aren't enjoying the pleasure of having trap after trap unexpectedly explode in their faces. And when they get tired of that, the situation grows even worse, as the tedious task of focusing entirely on one player looking for an attempt to disarm all of your traps devolves into a mind-numbing number of skill checks, which causes the rest of the group to lose interest as their attentions wander. What could possibly have gone wrong? Greetings, I'm your host Aten here at We Love TTRPGs, and I had been unhappy with traps for a long time. I was tired of traps being this weird aspect of role-playing games that were never integrated well into our adventures. They had always underwhelmed, failing to meet expectations, as what we see in movies or experience in video games never translated well to TTRPGs. Players are more likely to be annoyed by traps than feel energized and challenged. But what if we could change that with a simple solution that already exists within our game rules? And I mean any role-playing game, because though I'll be using D&D's current 5th edition when discussing mechanics, the advice here is easily useful for any system and genre. This video is going to focus on the most useful and practical information, so you can keep your entire party engaged and the game moving forward. Our goal is to stop traps from becoming the tedious, joy-killing nuisances they've frequently been since the beginning of the hobby. If you want to hear me rattle on about why this advice in the video is the best solution for fixing traps, and learn about 5 decades of traps from published materials with examples of my own traps, then stay tuned for part 2 of this video in the near future, unless you're living in the future when this video is already available. Although we'll be discussing game mechanics and boring, tedious stuff like that, there is one rule that reigns supreme, one rule that can negate all others, a rule that is paramount in making your traps, and therefore your game, enjoyable. Do not allow the roll of the dice to become a substitute for creative gameplay. In every game encounter and activity, regardless of the ability being used and the DC of the task, dice are there to determine final success or failure, but the player's creativity should be capable of influencing those results. Don't disregard common sense. It's okay to say no. It's okay to recognize some things just aren't going to be possible, but always remain flexible and open to different perspectives, because more often than not, players will come up with solutions the game master never considered. When players express their creativity, be flexible and willing to adjust your requirements for success. Just as any encounter could produce negative results for careless, reckless play, you should also be willing to reward your players for creative problem solving. When attempting to find secret doors, traps, or similar objects in a dungeon, a successful perception check doesn't necessarily explain in full detail what they found, only that they found something. The characters will be required to investigate further. Ask them to explain those actions, and the dice are only used if the declared actions still leave questions about success or failure. For example, if removing a rug from the floor reveals the trap door concealed beneath it, no investigation check is required. When using perception checks, remember a success might determine something is amiss, a breeze, an odd smell or noise, or anything else that might be appropriate to alert a character's senses. but it will not necessarily inform a player exactly what it is or how it operates. That will require further investigation. And before any dice are rolled, ask the players to describe their actions. If the player's actions are enough to succeed, then no dice are necessary. For example, if turning the wall sconce opens a secret door, and a player had indicated they were attempting to turn it, then no dice roll is necessary. Additionally, I never let my players get away with simply telling me they're going to attempt a social skill with just a roll of the dice. They need to explain to me what their character is saying and how they're saying it. Now, this doesn't require a degree in theater, and I don't expect every player to put on a performance. You must judge each player's contributions by their individual capabilities. Then, after the player describes their character's intentions and actions, the dice are there to inform us as to how effective the attempt was at achieving the desired results, if those results are still in question. This is true with every aspect of the game. When you apply this to dungeon exploration, specifically trap detection and disarming, it can help to draw your players into the environment. They will also enjoy seeing their creativity be rewarded, which leads to greater enjoyment for everyone. There have been plenty of times my players have come up with a solution to an obstacle that really surprises me and is far more creative than what I had originally considered, and I'll go with it. I'll take the position that I was the one wrong about the solution and that they discovered the correct answer. As a game master, you should leave your ego at the door and be willing to reward your players' creativity when appropriate. When thinking about dungeon exploration, allowing this type of flexibility really encourages all of the players to be active participants. And this is exactly why trap detection and disarming are no longer unique to rogues as it was in earlier editions. The 5th edition rules allows every player to be involved with trap detection and disarming. As game masters, we should try to accommodate this. Before we get into the specifics of traps, let's talk about detecting them. There's some things you need to remember. Dark vision has limitations that far too many game masters ignore. If the heroes are exploring a dungeon relying solely on dark vision, they're going to have a hard time avoiding traps. That's because dark vision treats darkness as dim light, and dim light is considered lightly obscured. Any area that is lightly obscured penalizes the explorers with disadvantage on wisdom perception checks that require sight. Furthermore, passive perception, which represents a character's basic awareness, is slapped with a -5 penalty. If, after that modifier has been applied, a very perceptive character still notices something unusual, that would typically be the limit of their knowledge without further study. Something here is unusual. Something feels off. What do you wish to do? And consider, if the party is only using dark vision, they aren't likely to see changes in color, thus missing the blood splatters on the wall, which might have warned them of the trap's presence. Another factor the game master must determine for every trap is the trap's past use and maintenance, if any. Has the trap claimed prior victims? Are there any signs of past use? Do traps reset? Does your dungeon have a cleanup crew scrubbing blood from the walls? Maybe there's a gelatinous cube on litter patrol. It's important to understand that without dungeon maintenance, it is possible for the remains of past victims to be present near the trap that would serve as a warning to new trespassers. This seems like a good time to remind you of that spell that nobody ever takes, Find Traps. This spell allows the caster to sense the presence of traps. A trap is defined by this spell as any obstacle specifically created to cause a harmful or undesirable result. This includes magical and mechanical traps, but not natural hazards or biological threats. I'll explain those later. Also, just as a successful perception roll, the spell only reveals the presence of a trap, not the exact location. However, differing from perception, the spell does reveal the general nature of the trap and the danger it poses. Many dungeon inhabitants, so long as their intelligence is greater than that of a simple animal, will want to use traps to their advantage. Intelligent creatures will likely understand that most intruders do not function well without light in an unfamiliar location. A common tactic for organized dungeon defenders will be to place their initial focus on extinguishing light sources and, if possible, lead the trespassers into traps. Speaking of dungeon occupants, it is important to consider what it must be like living in a trap location. If this area is inhabited by intelligent creatures, they must have a way of avoiding or bypassing the traps. Now for disabling traps, I have a few simple house rules to share with you. If a character fails their disable attempt by 10 or more points, the trap goes off, harms those in its way, and has been permanently damaged in some way that prevents it from being disarmed. At this point, you need to move through the trap or destroy it. I'll explain this later. If the deactivation is missed by 5 to 9 points, the trap goes off, but another disarm attempt is allowed. If the disarm attempt results in a natural 1, the individual attempting to deactivate it must roll a second time, and if that roll also fails by any amount, those thieves' tools are broken. If, on the other hand, a natural 20 is rolled, I grant the character an inspiration point. If they already have inspiration, they may give that to another nearby party member. Now let's talk about the problems with traps. If we think about the history of traps in tabletop role-playing games, we might notice how they seem to have encouraged a bit of the gotcha DM mentality. And that led me to wonder how that attitude carried over into other aspects of the game, which may have led to people having a bad experience. It seems to me that alignment and traps are similar, and that both can be fantastic additions to the game when used properly, yet both have a long history of being poorly described and abused. This lack of support for important game elements has frequently resulted in sapping fun from the game. The vagueness of alignment, for example, led some of the less experienced hobbyists to remove morality guidelines altogether, while traps still remain a source of aggravation for many players and game masters. If your players' characters are surprised by hostile encounters over and over and over again, that can really be annoying. Yet, forcing the players into surprising bad situations almost seems to be the point of many traps, which in turn fostered that dreaded gotcha DM mentality, leaving players frustrated. My solution sought to correct that. The 2014 5th edition DM's Guide and 2017's Xanathar's Guide to Everything have some decent charts and tips for categorizing and designing traps. But frankly, I didn't even look at either of those until I was putting the final touches on this video. What I found there is certainly useful information, and I do recommend using them as part of your creative process, but neither book resolves any of the problems preventing traps from being enjoyable to begin with. Looking at over 50 years of traps from past editions of D&D, third-party books and other role-playing games like the Indiana Jones and James Bond role-playing games, I was searching for game mechanics to make traps fun, and I felt so silly when I realized I was trying to create something that already existed. Are you ready for the secret? I discovered the answer was right in front of us the whole time. The answer is already in our game, right now. As they are presented, traps are inconsistent. Sometimes they require attack rolls. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they allow saving throws. Sometimes they don't. We need to correct all of this. Traps are confusing because they've always been treated as a separate part of the game. But we're going to fix that. We can all agree that mechanical traps are really just non-sentient machines. Machines that might be simple or complex, large or small. Most are stationary, but a few, like the Juggernaut or Rolling Boulder, have some limited movement. Mechanical traps have one or more functions that interact, typically in a negative way, with the player's characters. Have you looked at the stat blocks for constructs? Why aren't we thinking about traps as mundane, non-magical, non-sentient constructs? Everything about traps, other than an ability to act or think outside of the lone purpose for which they were built, describes a construct, which means they can be covered by the same parameters as every other monster in our game. Why have we been overthinking this for so long? Why don't traps just have monster stat blocks? A mechanical trap is really just a mechanical construct with no independent capability for thought. So why don't we just treat traps as monsters? Therefore, every trap will have a stat block, just like any other monster. It should have always been this way, and there should have been official publications devoted entirely to traps and their stat blocks, the same way we have books full of monsters. Instead of a beast or a fiend or a construct and so on, it's a trap. And just like there's different types of monsters within their groups, so too are there different types of traps. 5th edition D&D is so perfectly designed for this. So let's introduce you to this new type of monster and explain how it works. This really isn't complicated, and D&D already has everything we need to use this method. Before we continue, you probably have some questions like, what does this mean for disabled traps? Well, just think of disabled traps as a unique form of attack used against traps. Disabled traps is almost like an assassination, but specific to traps when we integrate our traps back into the game's existing mechanics. If a player successfully disables a trap, it becomes harmless or some other result as determined by the game master. By giving mechanical traps a stat block, they'll all have an AC and hit points, and that means every member of a party has something to interact with in familiar game terms. Traps can be harmed with weapons or spells, the result of which might raise or lower the DC for disarming it, depending on the game master's ruling. Is physical damage making it more vulnerable to deactivation, or is the damage making it more difficult to disarm? Is a magical trap immune to attacks from physical non-magical attacks? The hit points of a trap might represent the number needed to make it non-functional, not to entirely destroy it, as is the case with true monsters. When designing or using pre-made traps from other sources, consider the powers and limitations of those who created the trap. Were-rats living in a sewer will have simple roguish traps protecting their lair, while a lich's tomb could have anything you might possibly imagine. For this discussion, a trap is defined as any obstacle that remains dormant until a trigger activates it. And regardless of a trap's ultimate purpose, even the simplest of traps will challenge the players with a drain on resources, such as hit points, spells, consumable items, or at the very least, time. By wearing down characters in this way, traps make subsequent encounters more challenging and force players to carefully manage remaining resources. The current 5th edition DMG tells us there are 2 different types of traps: mechanical and magical. They place hazards in their own separate category. However, I believe there are 4 categories of traps when we include biological or natural hazards as distinct types of traps. A trap that is a natural environmental effect might be labeled as a hazard, but for this discussion, we'll still think of such obstacles as traps. Based on my criteria, we now have 4 categories of traps: natural, biological, mechanical, and/or magical. A trap may also be a combination of the 4. The only functional differences between natural and biological traps compared to mechanical and magical is they cannot be disarmed in the same fashion. Natural hazards might require clever, quick thinking, while biological traps might require combat. Whether you are designing a dungeon from scratch or reading from a published adventure, whenever a trap is included, you should ask yourself, what is the purpose of this trap? To determine a trap's purpose, we will place it into one of the following categories. The category you place it in ultimately determines the attack and damage numbers in its stat block. The first category of trap is to cause harm. Some traps are designed with the sole purpose of inflicting damage on anyone who triggers it. Some of those will seek to outright kill the trespasser. These traps are typically found in high security areas or as a last line of defense to eliminate intruders. These types of traps will deal significant damage with their attacks. If death is not the immediate desired effect, a trap might serve to maim intruders instead of killing them. Traps intended to incapacitate or maim intruders seeks to leave trespassers vulnerable to capture or further harm. These traps might cause severe injuries or debilitate characters in some way. Traps of this nature may inflict a condition such as unconscious, paralyzed, grappled, stunned, prone, and so on. This could also include regular damage depending on the trap. A tripwire could cause the prone condition, while a bear trap might cause the target to be restrained. The next category for traps is to capture or in some way hinder the intruders. Traps meant to capture intruders could be used for the purpose of interrogation, ransom, or other nefarious purposes. These traps might immobilize characters without necessarily causing lethal harm. Then there are traps that block, stall, or otherwise hinder intruders that are designed to impede progress, often giving defenders time to react or for reinforcements to arrive. They might create obstacles, barriers, or environmental hazards that hinder movement or limit options. These types of traps might also be combined with alarms or warnings that alert inhabitants of an intrusion. These traps might not cause direct harm, but instead trigger a response from defenders or activate other security measures. Within this subheading, you might also find traps that are intended to produce a result which confuses player characters. These traps might be used to disorient intruders, making it difficult for them to navigate the area or discern the true nature of their surroundings. Illusions, hallucinations, or shifting terrain are common elements of traps useful for this purpose. Similar to maiming traps, these traps could result in a condition, but they are less likely to directly cause immediate damage to their target. After you know the trap's purpose, you can begin to design the trap itself. Of the 4 categories of traps, natural hazards will include deadly real-world obstacles, such as quicksand. We also can think about the myth of the will-o'-the-wisp, also known as ignis fatuus, or foolish fire, which is a phenomenon reported in marshy or swampy areas. It appears as a flickering light or glowing orb that seems to float above the ground, luring travelers deeper into the marshlands. In folklore and mythology, it is often depicted as a mischievous or malevolent spirit, leading people astray. The explanation for the will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon in scientific terms involves the presence of swamp gases, particularly methane and phosphine, which can spontaneously ignite under certain conditions. These gases are produced by organic matter decomposing in oxygen-deprived environments like swamps and marshes. When the gases rise to the surface and come into contact with oxygen, they can ignite, creating a brief burst of flame. Thus, the myth of the will-o'-the-wisp is likened to a natural trap. The flickering light produced by the ignited swamp gases may resemble a torch or lantern in the darkness, leading unsuspecting travelers to believe that someone is carrying a light in the distance. As they move towards the light, they may become mired in the swamp's muddy terrain, unable to extricate themselves from their swampy grave. After natural trap-like hazards, we find biological traps, which include creatures such as the lurker above, the aptly named trapper, green slime, gelatinous cube, or the shrieker and violet fungi, to name a few of the more obvious and well-known examples. They are already given stat blocks and serve as just another justification for creating stat blocks for our mechanical traps. In fact, our next category is mechanical. They are traps that have been intentionally manufactured and positioned by sentient creatures. The mechanical or electronic in a futuristic game category is probably the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about traps, and this can be anything from a simple tripwire or concealed pit on one end of the spectrum to the more elaborate of dungeon defenses such as bladed chutes, crushing walls, falling ceiling blocks, or flooding rooms. Of the 3 categories, this has been the most difficult to properly implement, made doubly more cumbersome by the lack of useful support from official published materials. The final category of traps are those of a magical nature. Though these are generally intentionally created and placed, it is also possible within a magical fantasy game for some extraordinary places to spontaneously produce a magical environmental effect, like an area that produces wild magic effects. My party recently had a major combat on the remains of an ancient battlefield where the random magical effects created a lot of fun and memorable moments. Thus, a magical hazard serves the same functions as a trap, and magical traps are the easiest to create because all of the work has already been done for you. When placing magical traps, just take any spell or spell-like effect already found in the game and simply apply it to an object or place. When thinking about intentional magical traps, on one end of the spectrum, you might have a simple sleep spell emanating from an open bottle, all the way up to the horrendous and extremely deadly power of a sphere of annihilation, placed within a darkened portal of a lich's tomb. You might also include animated golems or other magical creations, cursed items, or even something that triggers an unwanted extraplanar summons. After having determined its purpose and type, you are ready to create your trap's stat block. Of my 4 categories, mechanical traps are the only ones you'll need to create those stat blocks for. Obviously, natural trap-like hazards and biological traps could not be disabled, but that's their only difference from mechanical and magical traps. If you think this all sounds confusing and I don't like change, just remember, It's the current 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide that already tried to make the connection. It says, complex traps work like standard traps, except once activated, they execute a series of actions each round. A complex trap turns the process of dealing with a trap into something more like a combat encounter. When a complex trap activates, it rolls initiative. The trap's description includes an initiative bonus. On its turn, the trap activates again, often taking an action. It might make successive attacks against intruders, creating an effect that changes over time or otherwise produces a dynamic challenge. Otherwise, the complex trap can be detected and disabled or bypassed in the usual ways. For example, it says, a trap that causes a room to slowly flood works best as a complex trap. On the trap's turn, the water level rises. After several rounds, the room is completely flooded. What the Dungeon Master's Guide gets right is a need for dynamic traps. What it leaves out is how to best do that, which makes no sense to me how they missed something so obvious. Just to make every trap a type of monster. At least treat it that way within our existing game mechanics. I'm going to give you 2 examples of how this is accomplished with a simple tripwire and a room with crushing walls. The Game Master has placed a tripwire in the sewer, concealed by sewage. We'll arbitrarily say the DC of detecting this is 10 since it's concealed by sewage. The first character to reach it then rolls initiative. The tripwire might have a set initiative of 20. It might roll an advantage, or it might have some other method of the DM's liking. When the tripwire's initiative is called, a grapple check is rolled against a DC 10.
If a PC fails their acrobatics or athletics check,
they fall prone. Perhaps there are also sharp spikes in the sewage for extra damage to anyone who falls down. There might even be a risk of disease or the poison condition if the spikes result in an open wound. That's a very simple trap. You could give it some hit points and an appropriate armor class, depending on the material it's made from. Now, with a stat block, the other party members can chop it with their axe or destroy it, and it could also be disarmed through usual means. On the other end of the spectrum, consider a chamber with crushing walls. I created this stat block as an example. The players walk into a room, and none of the explorers had a high enough passive perception to notice the rough marks on the ceiling and the walls and the floor. They didn't stop to investigate before entering. Now the doors are slamming shut, and they all must roll initiative. If a PC beats the trap's initiative, they can use their action to jump back out of the room, provided they succeed on a DC 10 acrobatics check. The initiative for the trap would be determined just as I described with the tripwire. But maybe this is a slow grinding trap that rolls initiative at disadvantage. Maybe this trap resets on a timer, and the only way to pass through is to be inside the room before the doors slam shut. Then the PCs would need to disarm the trap from within the room and pick the lock on the door of the far wall before they are crushed. This type of trap might have a lot of hit points, but there's many different methods creative players could use to slow the trap down. If the trap is not overcome, the walls will meet in 10 rounds, inflicting 10d10 bludgeoning damage every round until everything within is pulverized. Mechanical traps are really just mechanical constructs, and when you create stat blocks for them to represent this, they no longer exist outside of regular game rules, and you can better involve your entire group of players when attempting to overcome these types of challenges. When in doubt and looking for guidance to create your mechanical trap stat blocks, just look at the stats for constructs and simply remove any powers and effects that require sentience, since traps are still just dangerous machines. Ultimately, how you deal with traps will be a matter of personal style. But when we realize trap encounters should be treated like monster encounters, we've elevated our game's enjoyment. Players won't like being constantly surprised, so it's the Game Master's responsibility to give great descriptions that appeal to an adventure's relevant senses: sight, smell, sound, and so on. The Game Master is tasked with inspiring a player's curiosity, a subject I have covered in a previous video. When determining the DCs and damage of a trap, you can use advice from official publications, or you can just do it what I do and make it up based on your own design needs. There is no right or wrong way if you're having fun. And this is our ultimate goal, to have fun. My assignment for you now is to create stat blocks for 2 traps. One simple, one complex. Maybe a chest with a blade trap for your simple creation, and a falling ceiling with an electrified magical field for the complex trap. Anything you can imagine. If you are already skilled in creating stat blocks, this will be easy. But if you still have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me in the comments. I can't say this video has completely solved all of the problems, but I hope this information will have helped point you in the right direction. Stop thinking of traps as some unique outlier in the game, and just make them part of our existing rules. And if anyone thinks this takes away from the usefulness of rogues, I would just remind you, in 5th edition, detect and disarm traps is no longer specific to rogues. Also, we've tried it the other way for 50 years, and it's frankly been a fun-killing liability, not the exciting challenge they were meant to be. Just because we've been making the same mistakes for over 5 decades doesn't mean we should keep making them. Consider this the first of many videos covering traps. In a future video, I'll discuss in detail why the advice here really is the best solution, which comes from the nearly 30 minutes of content I had to edit out of this video. I'll also review some of my favorite trap books, talk about the history of traps in past editions, and show you some traps I've created for my adventures. Right now is a great time to be involved in the hobby because there are more resources and creative advice available to you than ever before. Creating stat blocks for traps is not much different than creating one for a construct. When in doubt, look at the resistances and other combat abilities given to constructs. If a mechanical trap is not activated, intruders might not become aware of its existence until it's too late. If you're new to running games, just keep it simple and avoid the temptation to become a gotcha DM. As always, I'm your host Aten, and I appreciate your support by telling the YouTube algorithm this video was useful, by stabbing the like button and letting us know in the comments what you think about the topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.